Settled up. Well, good afternoon. I want to speak today directly to residents in St. Louis County who care about public safety for their families and for their neighbors and for the community. We've heard a lot of talk about St. Louis County's budget, and a few people in the community on the council have said that we have a spending problem. But this isn't a spending problem, this is a revenue problem, and ignoring that reality is essentially defunding the police. So let's talk about all of this and let me explain why. Back in 2017, you, the voters in St. Louis County, passed Proposition P by overwhelming margins because public safety was a priority and you wanted to make investment in the police department. You said public safety mattered, and these new tax dollars did. They strengthened our police department. We invested in police officer salaries, we invested in new technology, we invested in training. We made a big investment. We invested in police stations. You made those investments possible by passing Proposition P. And we want to tell you that we've been providing police services with those funds now for almost 10 years. The cost of police services has gone up dramatically. Salaries, health insurance, police cars, fuel. The police department faces the same pressures as every other large employer. We're feeling the impact of tariffs and inflation. And you can take a look at this chart here on my right, which tracks a typical police officer's salary. In 2017, that chart, that officer's salary is shown in the red, was covered entirely by general revenue. And then you see the purple bar come into play as Proposition P funds became available. And then over the next 8 or 9 years, the police officer's salary has grown so that the majority of the fund now is covered, the salary is covered mostly by Proposition P. But the revenue streams have not kept up with the needs of salaries. So here's the truth that some of the council members haven't recognized. Proposition P does not cover the cost of rising police operations in St. Louis County. The fund wasn't designed to support a decade of increased cost. So you've heard some council members say that we could cut up to 90 police officers, but that number isn't correct. If there is no new source of revenue in the budget this year, then the cost is closer to 200 police officer positions. 200 police officers would change the way that county residents feel their police services. Slower response times, fewer officers on patrol, fewer officers in precincts, fewer officers available when you call 911. Longer waits for investigations, increased strain on the police officers who remain. This isn't hypothetical, this is math. Public safety is built on a foundation of personnel, on officers, on police officers, 911, dispatchers, investigators. 85% of the police department budget, 85% is people. So when you hear someone talk about cutting the budget, what they're talking about is cutting people, cutting salaries, laying people off. Now, some folks have argued that leaving positions unfilled creates a savings, but that isn't responsible budgeting. That isn't true. Leaving 200 police officers unfilled doesn't make the work disappear. The calls still come in. There's work that still needs to be done. There's problems that need attention. Vacancies mean fewer officers doing the work or some critical work going undone. And it gets worse. The county has already been forced to deal with vacancies this year. The council cut 181 police positions, unfilled positions, in last year's budget. And that strain on the department is already showing up in burnout, in overtime, in slower service. You can't run a modern police department by leaving vacant positions unfilled. Not if you want public safety to continue. So you may hear the phrase, this is a spending problem. That's a platitude, that's rhetoric, that's not a solution. If someone insists on only cutting spending, then ask them, which police officers do you want to cut? From which patrol, from which precinct, from which investigative unit? Which force, where are you going to go to cut the police officers? Which ones? That's what cutting spending means. It means cutting personnel. That's the reality of life. So I want to make this as plain as I can. If the council refuses to look for other sources of revenue, it's defunding the police. And there are several options in front of them. They could appropriate some of the remaining funds from the NFL settlement, like we did last year, and backfill the budget with that. We could roll up property taxes. The council has the authority from the voters to roll up property taxes and backfill and fill the budget an ongoing revenue stream with that. We could put Proposition U, a use tax or a sales tax, back on the ballot and ask residents again to come up with a new ongoing revenue stream. Or a one-time solution, 1 year, would be to go to the voters and ask them for permission to redirect the Youth Sports Inheritance Fund, the tourism money, and allow that to backfill the budget, and that would get us through 1 year. All of these solutions have their trade-offs, but we need a new source of revenue, and I'd be glad to answer any questions.
I spoke with Councilman Hancock yesterday, who suggested that before cuts to public safety, there should be cuts to the health department and some of the services that are offered that aren't required by the charter. I know you've spoken at length about why you view those as important, but strictly within what the charter requires, why should cuts to public safety come before cuts to health services?
So the question is, again, some of our council members wrongly believe that this budget can be cut significantly without cutting public safety, and that's just a misunderstanding of the available math. That just doesn't work. You could cut some of the services in the health department. We could reduce restaurant inspections. We could reduce community pool inspections. We could reduce mosquito spraying, or we could even reduce some of the health care to uninsured and underinsured residents in St. Louis County. I don't think that's our values. The health department has its own fund, and with the FQHC lookalike process, the health fund will soon be self-sustaining. But the problem in county government is the general revenue fund, and that is the vast majority of that is public safety. And there's no way to cut the general revenue fund without cutting police positions, and folks need to recognize that. They did 10 years ago when we passed Proposition P, and it's time to recognize it again.
Given how Prop U failed last week, what could be done differently to convince voters otherwise if it were on the ballot again in November?
Well, I think that if we put Proposition U back on the ballot, it's tough to ask folks to increase online sales tax when we're in an affordability crisis because of the war, tariffs, and all the other challenges in our country right now. That's a tough question to put in front of the voters. They have to choose between that and a reduction in force in the police department, because that's the only place to go in this budget. And this other graph clearly shows. I mean, the green line is Proposition P funds 10 years ago, and purple line is our salaries. Basically, our police department budget, which is 85% salaries. So we were cruising along until 2022, and we made another bump in our police officer salaries, which I support, and I believe they deserve every dollar of it. And I have no interest in cutting their salaries. But that completely consumed the green line, which is a Proposition P fund. And now we're upside down, and we have tens of millions of dollars in deficit in our police department budget, which again, 85% is police officer salaries. And we need to fill that hole. So we could go back and ask and explain that we need resources to fill this, and we have to negotiate with our council members and our voters in St. Louis County how we're going to do that. And we have really 4 options. When we had our town halls 3 or 4 years ago, what do we do with the NFL settlement funds? We heard a very clear message. Use your funds to provide core services of county government, and until you use those funds, don't talk to us about tax increases. We've got a little bit of those NFL settlement funds left, And if we're listening to those voters, we would appropriate those NFL settlement funds, and that'd get us by for another year or two in our budget. But we need a long-term solution. Those are one-time funds. And our long-term solution for stability, this is a 15-year problem in our budget, 15-year mismatch between revenues and expenditures. The way we fix this is with a sustainable revenue source, either new sales tax, a use tax, online sales like most other local communities have done across St. Louis and across the country, or we backfill it like a lot of communities have done in St. Louis and across the country with a property tax. We haven't rolled up property taxes in over 40 years. I would like to not do that, but what I like less is cutting police officers. And I think people in our community will see that too. The fourth option, besides NFL settlement fund, online sales tax, or property tax roll-up, the fourth option is to redirect the youth sports inheritance, the tourism funds that was supposed to be for ball fields, and we can take the kids' ball fields away, and that will give us 1 year of funding for the police department, but it's not a long-term solution. Those are the four options.
How do you make the pitch if you have the sales tax on the November ballot? I mean, do you do another educational campaign?
Well, certainly.
Do you do a traditional campaign?
I think that we had a modest effort by folks in the community who agreed with this to offer a persuasion campaign of why the use tax was important, and it didn't penetrate. With all the other noise on the August ballot, they just didn't penetrate. And it's a tough environment to talk about sales taxes when we're in the middle of an affordability crisis. It's a tough political environment, just like it was 3 years ago when we put it on the ballot. And 2 months before the election, gas prices went up $1 a gallon, and folks just weren't interested. But we have to let people in St. Louis County know where we are. We are at a crossroads in our budget, and we've got maybe 18 months to 2 years of one-time funding left. And you can only talk about property tax increases every 2 years. Every 2 years. And the window to talk about the property tax increase closes on October 1st. So that takes that off their table for the next 2 years. So then you have to hope the use tax passes, and you've got barely 2 years of one-time funds left to patch the budget. So 2 years from now, there's nowhere else to go. And, then you're laying off police officers. And if you don't spend some of the NFL settlement fund or ask the voters to redirect the youth sports fund, then you are cutting police officers next year because there's not enough general revenue to balance the budget.
What happens? Sorry, go ahead.
No,
go ahead.
Just a quick follow-up. So when you asked for the council to, advocate for this, I think you said that last week or earlier this week. Do you want them to do an educational campaign, or would you rather them use their campaign funds to
Well,
the
you
legal
can't.
problems that the county has faced with educational problems?
Yeah, I don't think you can ask elected officials to use campaign funds to tell a story of structural problems in county government that at least, especially one that's 15 years old. Now, there's some folks in the community come together for that, but it's not going to be effective unless the elected officials are out in agreement saying this is a good idea. All the elected officials have to be in agreement. There has to be a robust campaign from people in the community, stakeholders who agree, and then it has to be the right political environment for that particular tax. And if the political environment isn't right now for the use tax, then your only option is to consider a roll-up of the property tax, which the council already has the authority, the voters have given them the authority to do that, or backfill with NFL settlement funds and recognize that the day of reckoning is a year and some change away, and then you have no way out.
What happens in 18 months from now if nothing changes? Is St. Louis County going to have to file for bankruptcy?
No, I don't think the county files for bankruptcy. I think they have to lay off police officers, which it would be a very unfortunate and unpleasant experience for everyone.
What's the solution that you would choose?
I think my recommendation to the council would be to use the NFL settlement funds to get through this next year. The first year of a new county executive generally is honeymoon time, and I think the new executive and the council should get together and come up with an agreement and work together to get it done. It is reasonable to roll up the property tax at least partially this year to fill some of this gap. And I think the right solution is probably a combination of all four. It's to wait until the right environment for Prop U, and be intentional and together on getting it passed, to partially roll up property taxes to close the gap, to use some one-time funds, and as a last resort, go back to the voters. But you have to ask the voters to release the tourism funds for general revenue, because of the way that tax was collected. I don't really like taking away the kids' ball fields for the next 30 years to backfill the budget for 1 year. I don't think that's a good trade, but that's a last resort. So I would say a combination of the NFL settlement funds and a modest roll-up of the property tax is probably the best path forward right now. And come back in a year and ask for the use tax, and if it doesn't work, then you have enough NFL settlement funds to bridge you to the next 2 years away. If you do a partial funding now with a roll-up of partially the property tax, you could buy your time to get over the 2-year gap to the next time you could roll up property taxes, and you got another window of a year or so to pass Proposition U. And that's probably the only way you can do this without significant layoffs in St. Louis County. But even a 10% layoff across the board in St. Louis County, that's 190 police officers. That's 16 people in the Department of Revenue. That's your whole senior property tax freeze contingent. So this, we've got a day of reckoning coming in St. Louis County. And, I won't be county executive when this crashes, but you've got to have a 2-year timeline to figure this out. And we're up against the wall, and we haven't even talked about the headquarters yet. And we're not going to be in this building in a year. We'll be in temporary offices somewhere. We got to figure that out too. Okay. Thanks.